Hello, everyone. This is my podcast introduction to this week's program with Phil Hands of the Wisconsin State Journal. He's a political cartoonist. He says that he is a fierce political moderate. He's drawn national figures and state and local figures. He's syndicated. He's one of about 50 political cartoonists left in the United States. I greatly admire him and was so glad to be able to interview him. I had some doubts. How do you interview somebody uh, on an audio-only forum about something as visual as the political cartoon? But he was terrific, and I did my own research on this. I know a great deal about Theodore Roosevelt cartoons. I've given lectures about that, and we've had a symposium that focused in part on that at Jenkinson State University in Western North Dakota. And by the way, you should all come to our annual Theodore Roosevelt Center symposium. This one will be in September. And the subject this year is conservation. You can find out more about that by going to theodorerooseveltcenter.org. But we did one on political cartoons with Rick Marshall, who is a great historian of cartoons and has a book called Bully on some of the greatest of all the Theodore Roosevelt cartoons. Roosevelt was probably the most cartooned person in American history, with the possible exception of Richard Nixon. So it's fascinating, all of this. And so I had this chance to talk with Phil, and it was an amazing conversation. And you'll see on our website, ltamerica.org, some of the cartoons that he has drawn, and a couple of them that I've discovered about Thomas Jefferson. So I've known these existed for a long time, but I've recently begun to look more closely at them, and there are many, but the three that stand out are ones that we talked about on this program, including Jefferson as a prairie dog. Lewis and Clark captured a prairie dog in today's South Dakota, got it all the way back to Washington, D.C. alive. Jefferson displayed it. It was in hibernation, unfortunately, so pretty sluggish, but Jefferson displayed it at the White House, at the president's mansion, for a period of time, and eventually sent it on to Philadelphia for Charles Willson Peale, the great first American museum director and minor figure in the Enlightenment, a painter, among other things. He eventually died, and of course he had it displayed in taxidermy and so on. But it was the country's first, the eastern part of the country's first recognition of the prairie dog, and a cartoonist immediately said, I can make that work for Thomas Jefferson. So we'll have those on the site also. Amazing. And I just want you to hear a little bit of the after conversation that we had, just a minute or two, because Phil Hands said a really interesting thing, and of course it went through me like an arrow or a bullet. He said, someone can write an essay of 1,000 words and nobody will read it, but I can draw a cartoon and everybody will see it, which is a very, very interesting insight and, of course, critique of the sort of long-form work that I get to do. He's also agreed to do a cartoon of me in my Airstream to make fun of me on this quest I have to go see America. I wanted to be able to share with all of you an original cartoon that Phil will draw to make fun of me. I said, go ahead and make fun of me to the extent that you wish to. And so he's going to do that. It might take him a little while to produce that. But this is the sort of direction we're taking this program. Under the old rubric of the Jefferson Hour, it would have been pretty difficult to do this, except on the first section in which we talked about those Jefferson cartoons. But now that we've rebranded in this more ecumenical way, Listening to America, we have the chance to look at a whole range of phenomena, music and art, and in this case, political cartoons and geography and landscapes and the themes of water in the West and the future of race relations in the United States, the approach we're making to the 250th birthday of the United States on July 4th, 2026. All these things are possible, and they would have been a little bit constrained under the old rubric. So that's the main reason why we've changed the nature of the program, and it's all very, Very interesting. Let's go to the show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I have the pleasure today to be talking with Phil Hands, who is a newspaper cartoonist who lives in Madison, Wisconsin, and we've gotten to know each other a little bit over the last few months, so welcome, Phil.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to discuss editorial cartoons and their exciting and important part of American history with you.
How did you get started in this somewhat shrinking career? There was a time around the era of the two Roosevelts, Theodore and Franklin, when cartoons were one of the centerpieces of American newspapers. Today, not as much. How did you get started?
Well, so I'm relatively, even amongst today's editorial cartoonists, I'm still considered sort of a kid, even though I'm in my mid-40s now. I was really inspired to begin drawing cartoons at all because of the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes. Written by Bill Watterson in the 1980s and early 90s, and that inspired me to desire to become a cartoonist, which was I was actually reading a Calvin and Hobbes book, and I saw a cartoon in particular, and I said, you know what, this looks like an easy way to make a lot of money, and I was wrong about it being easy or a good way to make a lot of money, but I sort of got bit by that cartooning bug. And I was sort of passionate about becoming a cartoonist at the age of 15. And shortly after that, the local newspaper where I lived in Grosse Pointe, Michigan at the time, which is a suburb outside of Detroit, there was a local weekly newspaper called the Grosse Pointe News, and they had always run local political cartoons in that newspaper. And their cartoonist left for a bigger weekly newspaper. And I applied or showed the editor my work and decided I said I wanted to try it, give it a shot, and he gave me an opportunity when I was 16 years old to start drawing a weekly editorial cartoon about the community in Grosse Pointe, Michigan. I was paid $25 a week to do that, and at the time it was really exciting for me to have a deadline on a weekly basis and to really focus on local politics. I would take my sketchbook to the city council meetings and draw the city councilors and the various public officials, and they were terrified of me. And the idea of a 16, 17-year-old kid having that power to intimidate these adults in the room was really exciting for me. And I sort of just fell in love with the idea of being a political cartoonist, using sort of the opportunity to use both sides of my brain, I like to say, where I can be artistic and be creative, but also really analytical about the current events and the issues of the day. And so that's sort of my journey to becoming a political cartoonist. Started in high school, and I was passionate about it for forever. Kept at it through college. After college, I had the opportunity to come to Wisconsin, to Madison, and draw cartoons for the Wisconsin State Journal as an intern right after college. And I sort of have stuck around ever since. I went to grad school in Madison. In 2013, I was finally added to the staff of the Wisconsin State Journal and became a full-time cartoonist there.
So did you always know how to draw, or did you need to learn how to draw?
I was always okay at drawing, but learning how to draw is a skill, and I got much better at it over time. I'm still not particularly good at it, as there are much better artists out there than me. I just use artwork as a way to convey my perspective on the world in as simple and immediate a way as possible. Yeah, I'm a firm believer that drawing is a skill that you can learn. My college professor, a man named Martin Garhart, who was actually the same art instructor who instructed Bill Watterson, who drew Calvin and Hobbes, and also a pretty famous cartoonist named Jim Borgman, who was a political cartoonist who won a Pulitzer Prize in the 1990s. You've probably seen his work on the comic strip Zits, but he had the same art professor, Martin Garhart, and he was a firm believer that drawing was a learned skill, and you could teach a novice the tools to become a competent draftsman. It used to be that drawing was an important skill if you were going to be a scientist or a historian, or you would have to know how to draw to be able to convey ideas that were important. And so it's sort of something that we assume now that only people that are naturally amazingly gifted at art can draw, but anyone can draw.
Fair enough. So, your work currently appears in the Wisconsin State Journal. Is that what it is?
Yes, the Wisconsin State Journal is the newspaper that I work for. I actually work for their parent company, Lee Enterprises, which owns 77 daily newspapers across the country. And my work regularly appears in all of those newspapers. I'm also syndicated through Tribune Content Agency, so the cartoons are distributed across the country. I like to say that I get hate mail from all over America nowadays.
That's great. So we will post some of your cartoons at our site, ltamerica.org. You know, you say you go to city council meetings in Madison and so on. It's one thing to draw caricatures of famous people that are easily cartooned, like Richard Nixon or Henry Kissinger or Barack Obama. It's a little bit more complex, I'm guessing, to draw cartoons of people whose visage, whose look is not widely known.
Yeah, I mean, the easy out on that is you label them, but you try and but you try to create your own sort of version of them. And yeah, city council people are often difficult. They usually sort of have a button that identifies who they are. But I do enough cartoons about the mayor of Madison or the governor of Wisconsin that I can usually just get away with not labeling those people, and people sort of recognize my caricature as just a visage of them. When Scott Walker was the governor of Wisconsin several years ago now, he became sort of a high-profile governor, national figure. But the character that I created of him didn't really look like him anymore by the time I was done. But it sort of had a feeling of him, and it was a different character than who the man was. And that character, I loved drawing Scott Walker. That character that I created of him sort of spoke to me and would give me his own ideas. It was really interesting to create my own character based on a politician.
Has he ever spoken to you about your work?
Scott Walker actually did. He after an editorial board meeting, I serve on the editorial board at the Wisconsin State Journal, and we often have high profile politicians in to talk to us. And Scott Walker came in for an endorsement meeting, I want to say almost 10 years ago, it must have been. Grabbed me aside at the end of the meeting and said, he didn't like that I drew his ears so low on his head, but I got his bald spot right. And he explained to me that the bald spot that he had on his head was not male pattern baldness. He had hit his head on a cabinet at one point. His wife had said, "You should go have that looked at. You should have a doctor come check it out." And he refused to listen to his wife. And, when he finally went to the doctor a year later, the doctor said, "No, the hair's never going to grow back on that spot of your head." Now, do I believe that he didn't have male pattern baldness? Not at all. Not at all. But I thought it was a fun story. And it was interesting when our reporter was in the room at the time and wrote up that exchange the two of us had, and it became sort of a national story of Scott Walker was the governor that blamed his bald spot on a cabinet. And when he dropped out of the race, the New York Times described him as the governor who blamed his bald spot on the cabinet.
So this is your 15 minutes of national fame here, that you precipitated this conversation that was picked up by a reporter on that occasion. Have you ever drawn Donald Trump?
About 8 times a week, it feels like. I mean, I'm sick of the guy. I draw him ad nauseum. I actually try to avoid drawing him whenever possible because he is so ubiquitous and everywhere, and he loves the attention. But yes, I draw a lot of cartoons about Donald Trump.
Are there people that you really love to draw that like, oh, fantastic, I get to draw him or her, and other people that not so much?
Currently, I really enjoy drawing our current governor of Wisconsin. His name is Tony Evers. He is a mild. I did a cartoon recently where Joe Biden was visiting Wisconsin, which he's doing every week now. It seems like because we're such an important battleground state. And Joe Biden was saying it's great to visit Tony Evers because next to you I look exciting and dynamic and not as old, because Evers is the most boring governor that there could possibly be. He's a decent, honest broker who has good ideas for how to fix Wisconsin, but he's just not engaging or captivating. Drawing him has been really a joy recently.
You align yourself as a fierce political moderate. And yet you said a moment ago that you do get hate mail. Who do you upset?
It depends on the day. I mean, we live in a world nowadays where lots of people who align with the MAGA Trump movement don't understand how media works and don't trust media. I get a lot of hate mail from them, especially Trump. I don't agree with Trump on many issues at all, but one of the things that he did, which I think is really great, is that he brought people into politics who had never been engaged before. And so people had never seen a political cartoon before until they saw one of my cartoons criticizing Trump, and they thought it was completely outlandish that someone would draw a cartoon making fun of this great man who's running for president in their perspective and opinion, without understanding there's this history going back to Thomas Jefferson of people making fun of politicians in cartoons. And so I think that's a good thing that Trump has done, bringing these new people into politics, engaging them. But a lot of those people are very critical of my work because they don't agree with me on a lot of those issues. Now, when it comes to drawing cartoons about Madison, Wisconsin, I'm generally while I'm left of people in the Trump world, I'm to the right of a lot of people in Madison, Wisconsin. And when I draw a cartoon criticizing a council decision or the mayor, or I did some cartoons critical of the defund the police movement during the George Floyd protests, boy, did I get a lot of flack from lefties on those issues. So I like to consider myself a fierce political moderate. The right has gone way to the extreme, in my opinion, and so I'm probably a little bit pushed towards the left nowadays just because of how extreme the right has gotten. I'd love to be a old school Rockefeller Republican, but that position doesn't exist anymore.
Have you had death threats?
No, I have avoided the death threat. Serious death threats. I've had people explain to me that they own firearms. I've done some cartoons critical of the Second Amendment and firearms in America, and I've had people, sort of casually explain that they do have firearms when they criticize me, and I don't consider that a serious death threat. Other cartoonists have gotten much more serious death threats.
Phil Hens, we need to take a short break here. We're talking to Phil Hens, a political cartoonist in Madison, Wisconsin. We'll continue talking in the next segment, and starting with Thomas Jefferson. You're listening to a special edition of Listening to America. In the next segment, and starting with Thomas Jefferson. You're listening to a special edition of Listening to America. Welcome back to Listening to America. I'm talking to Phil Hens, a political cartoonist in Madison, Wisconsin. You're really caught between a rock and a hard place. If the MAGA people dislike you because you're occasionally critical of them and Donald Trump, Madison is one of the most liberal places in the world, certainly one of the most liberal places in the United States, dominated by the left, not the right, and you get some complaints from that crowd if you touch on any of the third rails that they feel strongly about. That's a sign that you're probably doing good work.
I like to think so. Yeah, Madison is probably the most progressive city in America. I think that we have districts that voted 90% for Biden in the 2020 election. So yeah, it's real lefty here.
Well, but there's Boulder, Colorado. I mean, don't get too ahead of yourself. There are 3 or 4 other places that would love to be the most liberal or most progressive place in America. I lived in Boulder, and Boulder is great fun, but it is so committed to being on the enlightened side of every question that it sometimes ties up the people of that wealthy city in pretzels. Let's talk about the history of.
It's exhausting, isn't it?
It's exhausting. Let's talk about the history of cartoons for a moment. So. I'm a Jefferson scholar, as you know, and I'm surprised that there are political cartoons relating to Thomas Jefferson, and there are quite a few. 3 in particular really interest me. 2 of them were drawn by a man named James Aiken, who lived between 1773 and 1846, so he was a young man, about the age of Meriwether Lewis. Jefferson was 30 years older than he was, and he drew 2 really remarkable, unfair, of course, cartoons about Thomas Jefferson. The first of them shows Jefferson as a prairie dog. vomiting up money to attempt to buy the Floridas. So not only our state of Florida, but the Gulf Coast all the way to Texas. They were known as the Floridas. And in 1804, Jefferson was wanting still to buy them. They were more strategically important to him than the Louisiana Purchase. And the cartoonist, James Aiken, shows Jefferson as a prairie dog puking money at the feet of these others, the people who might sell, including Napoleon Bonaparte. What's interesting about that to me, Phil, is that the prairie dog is very topical, because that prairie dog wouldn't have been known by James Aiken if Lewis and Clark hadn't sent a live prairie dog back from the West to Thomas Jefferson. So Lewis and Clark captured a live prairie dog in what's now South Dakota. They built a cage for it. They brought it all the way down, sent it rather all the way down the Mississippi and Missouri River systems to New Orleans. It went around Florida and up to the Chesapeake, to Baltimore, and by wagon over to Thomas Jefferson's White House. And so Aiken is making fun of the president for his interest in such things. At the same time, he's showing that Jefferson is being stung, I believe, by Napoleon. If you look at the upper left corner of the cartoon, a little hornet with a Napoleonic hat is stinging the prairie dog in the buttocks, causing it to vomit forth this money for the purchase of the Floridas. I think you would say that's a pretty complex cartoon, that there are too many things going on for it to be simple enough for a 20th or 21st century audience.
Yeah, it almost reminds me a little bit. There was a great cartoon in The Onion, which is the satirical newspaper, and the headline of the cartoon was "Cartoon is more complex than the issue it is describing."
Here we have it.
But this is really fun to look at. And this is a prairie dog that looks more like a sort of a coyote than the rodent prairie dog that I'm familiar with.
Yes.
Is there a difference between the two of those?
No, well, no. I mean, I don't suppose that Mr. Aiken saw the prairie dog. He just had descriptions of it, and so he drew something that looks a little bit like a hound dog and a little bit like a coyote and a little bit maybe like a prairie dog. But the idea was, it's like if you think of, say, Donald Trump with a haircut, that there's usually in a cartoonist something that they attach themselves to that provides an easy identification. Or they make fun of some characteristic, Nixon's 5 o'clock shadow and his hooked nose, or Henry Kissinger's sort of lugubrious, sagging face. So in this case, Aiken is making fun of Jefferson not only for his foreign policy, which is the point of the cartoon, but he's getting in a little jab about Jefferson's scientific curiosity, his fascination with such a creature as the prairie dog. But I think it's a good cartoon. In some of these early cartoons of this era, there are captions, like the bubble, the thought bubble or the speaking bubble, and sometimes they're whole paragraphs long. And when you look at them in books or online, you almost have to have a magnifying glass to read the text. That's an early phase of the cartoon before people figured out that they need to be simple, the text needs to be readable, you can't put too much in them, that they have to speak almost immediately to the audience, right?
Yeah, and that's a product of our modern fast-paced society too. I had a really smart professor once explain to me that, texts from the 1850s are dense and hard to get through because people had nothing else to do once the sun went down besides read by candlelight. This was the epitome of technology of early 19th century media. This cartoon that you'd see, this something that was in color in a newspaper or some sort of pamphlet or something like that. That was cutting edge, the most dynamic, exciting thing you'd see. And so you would take your time and look at this very closely. You wouldn't just throw it aside. This was a unique piece of art, and so I think that's why it can be so much more complex.
The second one by James Aiken that I think you have in front of you is called The Philosophical Cock.
Yes.
And it's much simpler, consists of an image of a rooster with Jefferson's face on it, looking a little bit lusty and salacious. And then the second figure you wouldn't necessarily know, Phil, but that's the famous Sally Hemings. So she's the hen.
Oh.
Jefferson is the cock, with obvious sexual innuendo, using the word cock, of course. And the story of Sally Hemings broke in 1802 in a Richmond, Virginia newspaper. It traveled like wildfire across the country. Everybody knew that there was an allegation of a sexual liaison with an enslaved woman, sometimes known as Dusky Sally. There were satiric poems and squibs written about it. And so they
With
used
an enslaved person,
with an
nonetheless.
enslaved woman. So, today we look on this in some quarters even as sexual assault because of the power differential between the enslaved woman, Sally Hemings, and the white master, Thomas Jefferson. But you can see why a cartoon like this appealed, because Sally Hemings is not labeled. We obviously know this is Jefferson. I saw you peering at it to try to figure out what's going on with the other figure. And so, when in Jefferson's time, when people saw him as the cock strutting with an obvious face, and then looked at the other figure, they would almost automatically think, "Well, that's a black hen. That's probably that's the rumor of Jefferson and the slave woman." And so, a very effective anti-Jefferson cartoon.
I'm looking deeply at the caricature of Jefferson on this, and I love how they've sort of made his face. They've really accentuated his age and made him look older. He's probably relatively old at this time, but he does not look like a dynamic sexual being as the caricature, which sort of plays into the idea of this being an inappropriate relationship. There's this old cock and this younger virile hen. Given the times and the all of the negative stereotypes about African Americans at the time and the nasty ways they were often depicted in cartoons throughout the history, this is actually a pretty respectful image of Sally Hemings.
Right. If you think of some of the images that were drawn of Barack and Michelle Obama during their 8 years in the presidency, some of them appallingly racist and demeaning. As you say, this is a more respectful, more generous depiction than you would expect necessarily from an anti-Jefferson cartoonist.
I think the cartoonist is probably sympathetic to Sally Hemings, actually, perceiving her as a victim in this relationship. But yeah, if you look at the history of editorial cartoons, throughout most of the 20th century, the depictions of African Americans are usually pretty atrocious. Lots of big fat lips and wide noses, and this is not that, which is kind of refreshing and interesting to look at.
You said something that I thought was absolutely correct, that Jefferson is depicted as an old man, which he was about this time. He was in his 60s, which was a very advanced age for that era. And when he became president in 1801, he thought that he might be too old to be president. Well, things have changed, haven't they? Yeah, that's hilarious. That's absurd today. But, when they first got together, let's put it that way, he was in his 40s and she was 14 or 15 years old. So she was just barely more than a girl. Brought his younger daughter Mariah to France. Sally Hemings was the chaperone, and she was about 14 years old. Automatically produces some cringe in us in the 21st century.
I guess it was common in Alabama recently. Didn't they have that guy who ran for Senate who had been dating prepubescent girls at the time?
Yes, there's a cartoon waiting to happen. All right, so let's.
I did one on that.
And
was,
what was it?
It was his name was Roy Moore, I believe.
Yes,
he was
it was.
Holding the
Used to hang out at malls and try to pick up young women in malls.
Yeah, he was holding the 10 Commandments, and it said said, "Do not covet thy neighbor's wife," but it doesn't say anything about his daughter.
Whoa! So did you get pushback?
No, I think people were pretty. I mean, people were so grossed out by the situation that I think everyone sort of agreed that was inappropriate at this time in the world.
So talk about that. So I want you to talk about a few of your cartoons, particularly in the final segment. But so all right. So Roy Moore is an older man who is most famous for insisting that the 10 Commandments should be on the courthouse lawn, and he defying federal injunctions to do so, and then he runs for office, and all this comes out that he has a special interest in young women, and it's not clear that he sleeps with them, but he sort of hangs around and preys on them, and the whole country is kind of sickened by this story. He claimed that this was all fake news, of course, but so you're a long way from the Deep South. You're aware of this story. If you can remember it, try to walk us through how you come up with the idea. Okay, there's this, the young women, there's the mall, there's this older guy, the 10 Commandments. How does your brain work to gel into a recognizable political cartoon?
I think that one probably just, a lot of times they're a lot of work. I think that one was sort of a hit by lightning kind of moment where you can point out the hypocrisy of someone who's so into the 10 Commandments, who is so clearly breaking sort of our modern day moral code of you do not, prey on young girls. Sometimes cartoons are a lot of work to get to one point to the other, but I'm pretty sure with that one, and I think I drew that's cartoon is almost 8, 9 years old now at this point, but I think that one struck me right away that we got to have this guy holding the Ten Commandments like Moses and saying something completely inappropriate.
All right, so let me just throw one at you, and I know this is unfair, but I was just reading a book about this yesterday, that at one point during his presidency, Donald Trump says that he'd like to buy Greenland from Denmark. And so this was, of course, insane and absurd, but he says publicly that he's thinking of buying Denmark. So if you had to do a cartoon on that, how would you go about thinking it through?
I would look at a map first of all and see what Greenland and Puerto Rico looked like, just to sort of and see if there was anything defining about the shapes of those two. Maybe it would be some sort of swap of Trump lassoing Greenland or kicking Puerto Rico like a football or something like that. I,
Trump makes it easy for your work.
a little bit. I mean, it's so absurd. One of the things that's hard about Trump is that the joy of being a cartoonist, the real joy is taking somebody who's decent and respectable and serious and making them ridiculous. Or somebody like Joe Biden and making him, ridiculous. But Trump's already ridiculous. He's already a caricature of what you think he would be, and he says things that I couldn't come up with, and he's serious about them. So it's a challenge to try and figure out how to lampoon somebody who's already a cartoon of himself.
Phil, look at one more Jefferson-related cartoon, if you would. This one is a pretty dense cartoon. We'll post it on the site. There's a small Napoleon on the right, very small, doesn't come up to Jefferson's shoulder. Jefferson was 6'2.5" tall. Napoleon has a sword.
And Napoleon was 4'1", right?
Well, I think higher than that, but not greatly. And Napoleon has an absurdly large French Revolutionary hat on. And if you look carefully at the sash that he's wearing, it's unmistakably a sort of a phallic symbol on the sash that dangles down between his legs. So obviously the theme here is that he has a small man's or runt complex. On the other side of Jefferson is a very rotund George III holding a stick with which to beat Jefferson. So the point of this is that Jefferson was trying to steer a neutral course between the Napoleonic Wars between Britain and France, and we had an embargo that failed, and Jefferson was doing everything in his power to make sure the United States wasn't drawn into this world war, partly because Jefferson was a pacifist, but also because he realized that this was not our fight. And so you have George III with his hand in Jefferson's pocket trying to get money a bribe of some sort to avoid drawing the United States into the war. And you have little tiny Napoleon on the right with his pulling actual coins out of Jefferson's pocket. So it's automatically understandable. I mean, nobody would not see that this is Napoleon. And George III maybe not so much, but clearly an Englishman. And that's certainly the tall, thin Jefferson in the middle. So the cartoon is sort of self-explanatory in a way, and yet the cartoonist, Peter Pencil, that I'm guessing that wasn't his birth name, has these long thought bubbles, huge, and the writing is so tiny that I can't read it. So obviously that's a style we don't use anymore, isn't it?
That's correct. Yeah, we would try and say this more simply in a political cartoon.
Pretty nicely drawn, though, isn't it?
It is nicely drawn. I actually can notice that, and this is just very, because we do this all the time as cartoonists. I can tell that the figure of Jefferson was drawn first, and then they very closely copied another image of him from somewhere else.
How do you know that?
I can just tell by the way it's drawn that it's sort of that the way that Jefferson is drawn is very realistic. Like it was taken from a official portrait or something like that, and it just feels like the head doesn't match the rest of the body.
It's very immediately identifiable, but keep in mind that in the time of Jefferson, when we had 6 million Americans, 1 in 5 an enslaved person. Most people in the United States had never seen Jefferson, of course, and most people in the United States had never seen an image of Jefferson. There was no photography. That was 30 or 40 years in the future, and there were some cartoons, but the newspapers were mostly local in nature, and so it would be almost impossible for someone living in Georgia or Vermont to say what they thought Thomas Jefferson looked like. But cartoons like this got us as close to to sort of an identifiable image as we could get in that era to someone like Jefferson. And Napoleon wins because of his size and because of the incredibly overdrawn military bicorn hat that he's wearing. So this has all the elements of the cartoons that we know and love. It's just text heavy.
Yeah, it does. And I do like that the stick that George is wielding is labeled Heart of Oak, which I'm sure had some significance at the time too. I mean, that's something that I do in a cartoon is somebody wields something and we label it to give it something else, some other sort of meaning.
We associate the big stick, of course, with Theodore Roosevelt much later in American history, but you're absolutely right that everything gets labeled here. And not to go too far with all the phallic imagery, although we seem to be forced into talking about it. Not only does Napoleon have that absurd sash, but the cartoonist Peter Pencil has drawn the sword on the side of George III in what might be regarded as a provocative way also. So, not to put it in too gross a terminology, but both of them are trying to screw America.
Yes, yeah, and it's interesting because I feel like newspaper readers are more sensitive today. Like they are not into the innuendos and phallic images in editorial cartoons. Like we can't get away with that nowadays, the way that people did back then. And actually, I did a cartoon once where I was drawing a cartoon about Vladimir Putin, and he was wearing military fatigues, pants, and one of the pieces of camouflage on there looks like a phallic image, and it was completely by accident that I did it. And my editor noticed it, and then after the fact, somebody pointed that out to me. I was like, "Oh my god, I can't believe I did that in a cartoon."
Freudian slip. We need to take a break. I'm talking to a really interesting political cartoonist, one of about 50 in this country in the third decade of the 21st century, Phil Hands of Madison, Wisconsin. When we come back, I want to ask you about your own favorite cartoonists and a little bit about cartoons post Thomas Jefferson. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to Listening to America. I'm talking with Phil Hands, a political cartoonist with several books, by the way, and you can find his work at Wisconsin State Journal. He's also syndicated, so you may have seen his work without knowing who he is. Cartoonists are often sort of anonymous figures. They occasionally rise above the radar to become well-known, but for the most part, when you see a cartoon in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, you take in what it offers and don't think too much about the author. I know that doesn't hurt your feelings because it's just the nature of the beast.
It's nice actually to be a little bit famous, but not so famous that it's an issue.
Exactly. I was surprised when I first learned that there were these political cartoons in the age of Jefferson because of the technology. These are printing presses where they were hand-setting type. To turn a drawing into a cartoon would be very difficult, expensive, time-consuming. And yet the visual is always so potent. But after this, the technology has been evolving until today. Of course, we've evolved right out of paper printing. But you have probably thoughts about the history of cartooning or favorite cartoonists that you have studied or are aware of.
Yeah, I mean, the godfather of modern day political cartooning, maybe modern day is a little too recent to say, but Thomas Nast, who was drawing cartoons in New York around the 1870s and 80s, maybe. Famous for taking down the Tammany Hall ring and Boss Tweed. That's sort of, I think every modern cartoonist sort of looks back as he was the first great American political cartoonist. He's so famous he was actually depicted in the movie Gangs of New York in one scene, So he was a man about town and everyone knew who he was. He developed, I believe it was the elephant is the symbol for the Republican Party, and helped popularize the donkey as the symbol of the Democratic Party. I think somebody else had done that first, but he really drove it home. He created the first images of Santa Claus. So when I think a lot of today's modern cartoonists, we sort of look back to him as sort of the first great American cartoonist. I'm a big fan of Herblock, who did amazing work in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and even the 2000s a little bit. He was a legend at the Washington Post and created the concept of McCarthyism, created the word McCarthyism, the whole concept of redscaping people or smearing them. He'd always draw these buckets of smear that would labeled McCarthyism. One of my favorite political cartoonists that people don't know about is Dr. Seuss. He did a lot of political cartoons. He was very anti-Hitler before the rest of the world was anti-Hitler. He did all of these amazing cartoons in the 30s with Americans being naive to the danger of the rise of fascism. And I think there's a great book called Dr. Seuss Goes to War that's just fascinating editorial cartoons.
Yeah, her block is famous for his caricatures of Richard Nixon, but of many other figures. He had a long and distinguished and nationally syndicated career as one of the nation's supreme cartoonists. Then you get sort of the crossover people like Gary Trudeau, who are sort of writing comic strips, but they're sort of political cartoons much of the
Oh,
time,
very
right?
political. I mean, I think Trudeau, Doonesbury, many newspapers, it appears on the opinion page, not on the comics page, because readers are very sensitive about what they get on their funnies pages, and they don't necessarily like to see, sharp, biting, satirical politics and commentary on their comics pages.
One of my favorite cartoonists is Gary Larson, who has some sort of he's like Stephen King on acid or something, but a very, very unusual way of seeing the world. And for a period I think it's the 1980s or so, he was ubiquitous.
He's a genius, Gary Larson. He's one of my favorites too. I often think of my favorite Gary Larson cartoon, and you can describe it. But it was had the sort of heading of while fumbling for his light switch, disaster ensued, and you can see a guy in an airplane, and on the armrest there's lights, call button, wings stay on, wings fall off. And I just something about
What a
I loved his sick view of the world.
Let's talk about Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a larger than life figure. He was almost a self caricature. I've done lectures on my favorite Roosevelt cartoons, and there are legions of them. You have a book in front of you. My friend Rick Marshall produced a book called Bully, I believe, that has a set of Roosevelt cartoons. No one book could contain them all. You've met him, right, at cartoon
I believe
conferences?
I did. Yes, yeah.
You all gather from time to time, do you?
Yes, we do. I don't always make it out, but we try and get together once a year as a group of political cartoonists and discuss, the future of the industry and how we move forward. It can be depressing.
I'm sure it can with the one newspaper after the next blinking out. How is that working? The transition from print to digital. How do digital cartoons have the same impact that print did?
It's hard to say. I mean, what's hard is to monetize the digital prowess. I mean, I think Herb Block was one of the greatest cartoonists of the 20th century. And I'm no Herblock, but I bet you more people have seen my cartoons because of the internet. That doesn't make me a bigger deal, but I think our work is more ubiquitous. It's everywhere out there. It's shared on social media, it's shared on Twitter. I had a Canadian politician repost one of my cartoons and alter it to fit Canadian politics recently.
Back to Theodore Roosevelt. You have favorite Roosevelt cartoons?
Not particularly. I mean, I've drawn a couple of them. I wouldn't be able to list my favorite ones, but he is so with that 1,000-watt smile and that big bushy mustache. He is just a cartoonist's dream.
Of course, there's one of my favorites is and everybody knows this one of Roosevelt walking around the Caribbean hauling ships and controlling the Central and South America. This is after the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Another one is of Roosevelt himself digging the Panama Canal right across the isthmus. He's a giant and digging with a shovel the Panama Canal across the Isthmus of Panama.
Didn't he actually hop in one of the combines at one point and do some of the digging at the Panama Canal in real life?
Yeah, he and his wife Edith went to the canal zone in 1906 while he was the first president to leave the country during his time in office, and they went down there, and he did an extraordinary job. Of course, he personally identified with the Panama Canal, which was righteous. It's true, but he had a white Panama suit, and then he went down into one of the famous cuts in the mountains, and he was in a Bucyrus steam shovel and was allowed to operate the steam shovel for a few minutes before he could do any real damage. But there's a famous photograph of Roosevelt in a white suit digging the Panama Canal.
What a different era.
But of course, the most famous of all the cartoons of Roosevelt was by Clifford Berryman. Had an impact way beyond the cartoonist's idea, beyond his hopes. Roosevelt went to Mississippi in 1902 to hunt bear. He couldn't get a bear, and one of his handlers found an old she-bear sleeping and clubbed it and tied it to a tree. And then when Roosevelt came up, they said, "Now you may kill your bear." And of course he scoffed and said he wouldn't do that, that's not sport, that's not the Roosevelt way. And so Clifford Berryman, who was a prominent Washington Post cartoonist, drew this cartoon of Roosevelt looking indignant and turning away, leaning on his rifle. And the bear is not an old she-bear now, it's a tiny little cub bear. And the title of the cartoon is Drawing the Line in Mississippi, in part because Roosevelt was there as the president of the United States to help adjudicate a border issue between Mississippi and another state. Mm-hmm. And so a lot got packed in there. But the public loved this. They loved this depiction of this cub bear. And so that's one of the sources of the teddy bear. And Berryman, for the rest of his long and extraordinary career, whenever he was depicting Roosevelt, he put that same bear somewhere in the frame as a sort of TR signature.
It is a cute bear.
So we're recording this a week after the State of the Union message in 2024, where President Biden, who's over 80 years old, was very spirited and talked back to hecklers and seemed to really relax into one of the best public presentations he's had during the course of his presidency. So how did you decide to ennoble that in a cartoon?
Well, I actually it was pretty simple, but it was Joe Biden saying the State of the Union is strong, and then for the moment, and there was a looming figure of Trump behind him. It and it was Trump sort of peering over, just a giant Trump. You just saw his eyes and his hair kind of hanging over the balcony. It was sort of an imposing figure. Just to share that, like, I think right now the union is strong because and a Trump presidency will severely weaken it.
You know, Madison, Wisconsin is one of the most woke places in the world, I would say, and the sensitivities on college campuses now are so pronounced. Many stand-up comedians refuse to do university and college gigs now because the students are just so willing to be offended and push back hard and denounce and so on. I'm guessing most college students have better things to do than to look at the Wisconsin State Journal. But do you have any sense of that wokeness is an issue in your work?
Yeah, I mean, there's a group of University of Wisconsin students and faculty who are who hate my guts. You know, they hate my guts. They think I'm a horrible racist and a pawn of white patriarchy because I am a white guy. You know, and so they hate me, and I'm okay with that. You know. We call them in Madison the perpetually offended. I would say it's not even the perpetually offended. I think people nowadays, unfortunately, especially young people of a certain ilk, seek out being offended, seek out ways to be offended by issues to show how virtuous they are. Plenty of people tell me that I'm doing good work, that it's I get balance from both sides.
So you have a cartoon, let's say, showing that President Biden is falling down or whatever. When people want to react, how do they do so? Do they email you directly? Is there a posting site in the newspaper? Do they contact your editor? What does the pushback look like?
I get angry emails. I get angry phone calls. I get angry tweets. I get angry messages on Facebook. I even still get angry handwritten letters from people. So there's all sorts of ways that people can express their disdain for me. Usually older people will give me a phone call or a letter. Younger folks will attack me on Twitter. But yeah, and I wouldn't say I think the angry phone calls are my favorite just because I get to interact with people. I had a guy recently call me and tell me what an idiot I was. He left me 3 voicemails over the New Year's holiday and told me what an idiot I was, and I finally decided to call him back and say, "Sir, was there a specific complaint you had, or were you just venting?" And he said, "I'm sorry, I was drunk when I called you. I apologize." It's very Wisconsin-y.
The first hate mail that I get is hateful, I always write back in the manner of Jefferson, as civilly as possible. And I answer if they say you were wrong about such a thing, and I'm sorry you were ever born, and I hope you die a long, lingering death with acid on your face, that kind of thing. I write back and I engage them on the substance of it, and then at the end I say it would be so much easier to take you seriously had you been civil. And the thing about that, Phil, is that I almost invariably get a letter of apology after that, saying not so much I was drunk, but I was angry. I shouldn't have done that. Thank you for taking me seriously. Most of that is a shot across the bow, right? They want to be heard. They want you to acknowledge their point of view.
That's correct. Yeah, I'm less articulate than you. I usually just respond with "Thank you for your constructive criticism" when people say I'm an idiot.
Do you think they feel the irony of that?
I think they do. Once they realize that the person they're criticizing is actually a person that has a whole perspective on the world, they're much less angry about the issue. I found that maybe that's just because people are nice in Wisconsin, which I think is actually a true fact. But when I have a conversation with anybody, no matter how much we disagree, we usually come to a civil, ending to the conversation.
So, in the few minutes that we have remaining, I have a couple of other questions for you, Phil. One is, why are the ranks of cartoonists shrinking? It feels to me, and maybe I'm wrong, but the golden era of cartooning is behind us now by about 30 years. And that it's only going to become more so, that there will probably be fewer and fewer political cartoonists. Am I just wrong about that, or is that where we're headed?
Well, I think cartooning is so. I think the ranks of people like me who work at a newspaper, who draw cartoons consistently about the leaders of the country, that's shrinking because there's not a lot of opportunities for it. People that would have this talent are doing other things. Maybe they're working at some sort of brilliant artists are working in video games and digital painting and all sorts of other venues that are more profitable and more sustainable. There are a lot of young cartoonists that are drawing cartoons that don't look like your traditional editorial cartoon. Sometimes they're a little more in depth in telling a story, and I would say they're wordy, but that's just because I'm old and cranky. But a lot of younger people are sort of doing things that don't look like your traditional editorial cartoon. I'm probably doing this because I sort of had a goal and a vision to be an old school cartoonist, and I was able to do it. I'm really fortunate to do it, but I can't see my job existing for the next person behind me at the Wisconsin State Journal. And I think the young, talented people have seen that as well. But I don't think cartooning is going away. I think it's just going to change. And we're going to, the internet's full of editorial cartoons called memes making fun of people left and right. Now, are they as good as what I can do? Absolutely not. But people will always have a passion for satirical commentary with its image driven about our political leaders.
Indeed. And of course, we're living in the age of the graphic novel. You go into a bookstore today and there is an acre of graphic novels. 30 years ago, that would have been almost non existent. And so there is still a great love of the visualization of ideas.
I think you're absolutely right.
So, Phil, your cartoons have not been gathered into a book. Is there an archive? Can people go to a website to see them?
Yeah, the Wisconsin State Journal's website is madison.com. Most of my recent work is there. My Facebook page has a whole collection of my work going back for forever. It's Phil Hand's Editorial Cartoons is my Facebook page. And I need to get together and put together a book of my work. I've been working at the State Journal now for over 10 years, and 10 years sounds like a good time to collect things and sort of remember how smart and brilliant I used to be and how much I've fallen off since then.
So I hope you will produce a book. That would be, I think, a really valuable thing for you to do. You're a young man. How long are you going to do this?
As long as I keep getting paid. And I probably will continue doing it long. I don't envision a world where I'm not drawing political cartoons. Maybe that's naive of me, but I can envision a world where I'm 80 some years old and finishing up a cartoon to send out to syndication before I hit the golf course in the morning. I can see myself doing that.
Let me ask one last question, kind of probably an unfair question. If God the Archivist called you and said, Phil, I want one and only one of your cartoons that you're especially proud of to be in a time capsule so that people will know who you were and the quality of your work. Do you have a a cartoon or a short list of cartoons you would nominate for that?
I've got two. One of them is a national cartoon, and it features some of the most fun people to draw. It has Barack Obama, Vladimir Putin, and Donald Trump in it. And it was called. People used to always criticize Barack Obama for being outsmarted by Putin, and they would say he was playing checkers and Putin was playing chess. And so the cartoon is titled "Playing the Foreign Policy Game." And you see Obama, and he puts his checkered piece down, and he says, "King me." Putin says, "Checkmate." And Donald Trump jumps in with his hands, and he says, "Scissors," because he's playing rock, paper, scissors. So I liked that cartoon because it sort of encapsulated everything. But my favorite cartoon, which is very specific to Wisconsin, you might have heard about this, but the Milwaukee Brewers have a sausage race at the seventh inning of each game, where a group of people dressed as sausages run around the stadium. Whoever wins a prize or whatever. But it's pretty famous in Wisconsin. The racing sausages are a household name here. And back about 10 years ago, Arizona had an immigration law where they were going to start pulling people over because they could pull people over for any reason and ask them for their immigration papers. And a person in Wisconsin said we should have a law like that in Wisconsin. And so I envisioned what an Arizona-style immigration law would look like in Wisconsin. And I had a cop pulling over the chorizo sausage asking him for his papers. And the other sausages were allowed to run away.
I'm so glad to have this chance to talk with you. This has been most enlightening. Hard to talk about visual art on radio, but you've done a superb job of it. Phil Hands of Madison, Wisconsin, thank you. To all of you out there, we'll see you next week for another important edition of Listening to America.